Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It truly means everything to me. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Let me take you to Chicago. Not the Chicago of gleaming skyscrapers and tourist postcards, and the glittering lights that reflect off Lake Michigan on a summer evening. I want to take you somewhere else. I want to take you to a smaller Chicago, a quieter one. A working-class Chicago made of two flat brick houses and corner taverns and Catholic school, uniforms, and the smell of summer dinner drifting out through a cracked kitchen window on a cold winter afternoon. A Chicago where every family on the block knew every other family by first name, where the children ran freely between houses as if all the front doors belonged to all of them equally, where the local priest knew your name and your mother's name and your grandmother's maiden name and the particular sin you had confessed to 3 Sundays ago. A Chicago where the 1950s still meant something real and solid, where a neighborhood was not just a geographic location, but an entire world unto itself, complete and contained and warm in the way that only truly small worlds manage to be. This is McKinley Park, a neighborhood sitting on the southwest side of the city, tucked comfortably between Bridgeport and Brighton Park, where the streets carry the names of American presidents and the bungalows line up in long, even rows, their small front lawns disappearing under snow every winter, their windows glowing amber at dusk when the working men came home, and the mothers put dinner on the stove, and the television sets flickered to life in the front rooms, and the children did their homework at kitchen tables under the yellow light of overhead bulbs. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew exactly what they had, where they counted their blessings quietly and held on to them with both hands. A neighborhood that believed in Mass on Sunday and hard work on every other day, and keeping your children close and your door locked because this was home. And home, McKinley Park in 1956, was supposed to be the one place in the world where nothing bad could reach you. The year is 1956. The country is running on a kind of electric post-war optimism that fills the air like a current you can almost feel. The economy is expanding. The suburbs are spreading outward from every major city like rings on a still pond. American families are buying refrigerators or automobiles and television sets and believing, with a sincerity that is almost painful to look back on, that the future is going to be better than the past, that the sacrifices of the war years have purchased something permanent and good. And everywhere across this confident, humming, impossibly hopeful country, in every diner and soda fountain and 5 and dime store, pouring out of every jukebox and radio and record player in every teenage bedroom from coast to coast, there is one voice, one name, one young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, who has done something to the American nervous system that nobody has quite found the words for yet. Elvis Aaron Presley, dark-haired and dark-eyed, with a voice that moves between tenderness and electricity like weather changes, and hips that your mother has strong opinions about, and a smile that makes you feel personally selected. He has rearranged something fundamental inside an entire generation of American teenage girls. His records sell faster than the pressing plants can make them. His face appears on magazine covers in beauty parlors and dentists' offices and grocery store checkout lines across the country. Girls who have never in their lives raised their voices above a conversational level are screaming themselves hoarse at his concerts. Girls who have never cried over someone they have never met are crying. And the girls of McKinley Park, on the southwest side of Chicago, in their 2 flat brick houses with the amber windows and the rosaries hanging in the hallways, those girls are absolutely, completely, and without any reservation no different from any other girls in America when it comes to Elvis Presley. They love him the way you love something when you are young and your heart is still capable of that particular variety of total commitment that adulthood gradually teaches you to be embarrassed about. Among those girls are 2 sisters. Barbara Grimes is 15 years old. She has dark hair worn neatly and a quiet, contained kind of beauty. Not the kind that announces itself when she walks into a room, but the kind you notice slowly, the way you notice good light entering through a window, gradually and then all at once. She is a sophomore at Thomas Kelly High School on the Southwest Side, and she is a serious and careful student, the kind of girl who completes her homework before anyone has to remind her, who takes notes in class without being told to, who pays attention not because she is afraid of getting in trouble, but because she is genuinely interested in understanding things. Her teachers speak well of her. Her classmates like her. She is not the kind of person who dominates every social situation she enters, but she is the kind of person a room feels subtly different without, a little quieter, a little less warm. She has a smile that people tend to remember long after the moment that produced it has passed, because there is nothing performed about it. She smiles when she is happy, and she is happy often enough that the smile is familiar to everyone who knows her. She has plans. She thinks about her future the way 15-year-olds do when the future still presents itself as pure possibility, as something wide open and generous, full of things she is going to do and places she is going to go, in a version of herself she has not quite become yet, but can already feel waiting her just around the bend. She is a good daughter. She is a careful older sister. She is the kind of person who, when she leaves a room, people look up from what they are doing for a moment, the way you look up when a light has been turned off somewhere in the house that you were not consciously aware of until it was gone. Her sister Patricia is 12 years old, going on 13, and where Barbara is quiet and measured and steady, Patricia is pure, uncontained electricity. She goes by Pity, a nickname that fits her so perfectly it is impossible to imagine her being called anything else, because there is something about her that fundamentally refuses to be pressed into a smaller or more manageable shape. She is a 7th grader at St. Maurice Catholic Elementary School, and she is a good student, but academic achievement is not what Patricia Grimes is known for among the people who know her. What she is known for is her personality, her laugh. The kind of laugh that starts somewhere deep and comes out loud and genuine and completely without self-consciousness. Her opinions, she has them about everything, and she shares them freely, and she is usually more right than people initially expect. Her energy, the way she enters a space and the space reorganizes itself slightly around her presence, the way conversations shift direction when she joins them, the way things become more interesting, more alive, more worth paying attention to when Petey Grimes is in the room, and what Patricia Grimes loves, what she loves with the full, unguarded, absolutely committed force of a 12-year-old heart that has not yet learned to hold anything back, is Elvis Presley. She is, by any reasonable measure, one of his most devoted fans. She knows every song he has recorded. She knows the plots of his films and the names of his co-stars. She has accumulated the kind of detailed, passionate knowledge about him that a serious academic might accumulate about a historical figure, with the same thoroughness and the same genuine investment. She has joined his official fan club. Barbara has too. They signed up together, because that is how the Grimes sisters do most things together. Together is the operative word when it comes to Barbara and Patricia. They are sisters, yes, but they are also something more specific than that. They are close in the particular way that some siblings are close, the way that makes outsiders feel they are witnessing something private and complete, something that does not require anyone else's participation to be whole. Former neighbor Melanie Forgala, who grew up near the Grimes family, remembered them this way years later, as inseparable, as a unit, as two people who were more fully themselves when they were together than when they were apart. The family lives at 3634 South Damon Avenue, a modest house on a modest and entirely ordinary street in the heart of McKinley Park. There are 7 children in the Grimes household, altogether a large, warm, sometimes beautifully noisy Catholic family in the old Chicago tradition, the kind of family that fills every room it occupies simply by existing at full volume. Their mother, Loretta, works as a company clerk for Park Davis Pharmaceuticals. Their father, Joseph, works as a truck driver. Their older siblings are Theresa and Shirley. Their younger brothers are Jimmy and Joey. It is a house full of the particular kind of life that 7 children in one space naturally generates. The arguments over the bathroom and the last piece of bread. The laughter that erupts without warning and fills the whole floor. The quiet moments that are quiet precisely because they are surrounded by noise. And the deep, unspoken understanding that runs beneath all of it like a current. These are your people. This is your place. Whatever the world outside this house turns out to be, this is where you belong. Loretta Grimes is the center of that house. She is not a woman who wastes words. She is not a woman who gives her permission easily or without thought, who lets things slide because she is tired or distracted or because it is easier to say yes than to say no. She is a mother who knows where her children are, at all times, and what they are doing, and when they are supposed to be home, and she notices, immediately, without fail, when any of those things are not as they should be. She is the kind of mother whose children are slightly afraid of disappointing her, not because she is cruel, but because her approval means something. Because her opinion of you matters, because she has standards and those standards are not arbitrary, and her children know it. The life of the Grimes family in December of 1956 is the life of a working-class Catholic Chicago family doing what working-class Catholic Chicago families do. They go to church. They do their homework. They eat dinner together at a table that is not quite large enough for all of them. They watch television in the evenings. The kind of programs that the whole family can watch together. Variety shows and westerns in the news. They know their neighbors. Their neighbors know them. The rhythms of their life are the rhythms of their neighborhood. And the rhythms of their neighborhood are the rhythms of a city that still believes in the kind of order that makes ordinary evenings feel safe. Their life seems complete. Their world seems whole and right and permanent in the way that ordinary happy lives always seem permanent until the moment they are not. And then December comes. And Christmas passes. And the day after the holiday arrives with a cold so sharp it has edges. A cold that settles into the city like something that intends to stay. And the streets of McKinley Park empty out in the early evenings, because nobody stands outside in that kind of cold any longer than they absolutely have to. And the windows of the bungalows along South Damon Avenue glow with the amber warmth of families inside, doing the ordinary things that families do on ordinary winter evenings. It is December 28, 1956. A Friday inside the house at 3634 South Damon Avenue. Barbara and Patricia Grimes ask their mother if they can go. Unusual request. It is in fact a very ordinary one. The Brighton Theater is only 1.5 miles from their front door, close enough that the girls have made the journey dozens of times without incident, without anyone worrying, without it ever being anything other than a perfectly routine and thoroughly unremarkable neighborhood activity. Loretta knows this theater. She knows the road. She knows that her daughters have walked it or taken the short bus ride more times than she can count. There is no reason on the surface of things to hesitate. What makes this particular evening slightly different is the film, Love Me Tender. Elvis Presley's very first motion picture, a Civil War drama that climaxes with Elvis's character being killed in a shootout, a scene that Patricia, in particular, has found devastating on every single one of the many previous occasions she has watched it. This will be approximately the 10th or 11th time the Grimes sisters have seen this film together. Patricia shows no sign of being tired of it. Barbara is patient with her sister's devotion in the way that older siblings sometimes are, with a gentle tolerance that is its own form of affection. The movie is not really the point. Elvis is always the point, but Loretta almost says no. This is the detail that people who know this case cannot stop returning to. The detail that has the particular weight of all the things that did not happen, all the decisions that went one way when they might have gone another. Something had happened the night before. The girls had come home late. There is a suggestion, imprecise, recalled differently by different people, softened by time and grief and the impossible difficulty of trying to remember accurately what was true before everything changed. That Patricia had been seen crying at some point during that prior evening. Why she was crying, what had upset her, whether it was connected in any way to what was about to happen, nobody has ever been able to say for certain. But there had been a curfew missed, there had been a moment of friction, and Loretta Grimes, standing in her kitchen on December 28th with her daughters in front of her asking to go to the movies, thought about saying no. She said yes. She said yes because they were good girls and she knew it. She said yes because it was 1.5 miles, and they had made the trip 100 times. She said yes because it was the holidays and her daughters were happy and alive and standing in front of her asking for something so simple and so normal that refusing felt like punishing them for nothing. She told them to be home before midnight. She counted out $2.50 for the tickets and the popcorn and told Barbara to hold back 50 cents in case they wanted to stay for the double feature. She watched them put their coats on. She watched them head for the door. She watched them go. The girls left 3634 South Damon Avenue at approximately 7:30 in the evening. It was already completely dark, the early winter dark that falls on Chicago in December like a curtain being dropped without warning, sudden and total. The temperature was somewhere well below what anyone would call comfortable. The streets were quiet. The neighborhood was doing what it always did in deep December, pulling itself inward, gathering around its own warmth, leaving the outside to the cold and the dark and the silence. Barbara and Patricia walked down South Damon Avenue, past the houses of people they had known their whole lives, past the storefronts that had been there since before they were born. Their breath rose in small white clouds above their heads. Their footsteps rang out sharp and clear on the frozen pavement. They were talking, probably they were almost always talking when they were together, filling the space between them with the particular easy conversation of people who have never had to perform for each other, who have never had to be anything other than exactly what they are. They were happy. They were going to see Elvis. The night was ahead of them, full and whole and entirely theirs. Whether they walked the full 1.5 miles to the Brighton Theater or caught the bus for part of the journey has never been definitively established. Given the temperature and the fact that they had bus fare available, it is widely believed they took the bus for at least a portion of the trip. What matters is that they arrived. They arrived safely, and they were seen inside the theater, and their presence that Friday evening has been confirmed. A classmate of Patricia's named Dorothy Weinert was there that same night with her younger sister. Dorothy would tell investigators, in the days that followed, that she and her sister had been seated directly behind Barbara and Patricia during the first screening of Love Me Tender. She remembers them clearly. Both girls, present and normal and happy, absorbed in the film the way you are absorbed in something you have chosen for yourself and are enjoying without reservation. When the intermission came, the break between the first and second screening, when the lights came up and the crowd shifted, and some people decided to call it a night, Dorothy and her younger sister decided to head home. It was around 9:30 in the evening. As she was leaving, Dorothy looked back and saw the Grimes sisters standing in the concession line, waiting for popcorn, both of them together the way they always were. Barbara tall and dark-haired, steady. Patricia smaller, already probably chattering about something, already impatient for the lights to go back down. They looked fine. They looked like exactly what they were. Two sisters at the movies on a Friday night in December, doing something they loved, in no hurry to be anywhere else. Dorothy Weinert walked out of the Brighton Theater and into the cold, and that was the last time anyone who has been able to be confirmed as a reliable witness saw Barbara and Patricia Grimes alive. There is no soft way to say that. There is no framing of that sentence that makes it easier to sit with. The last confirmed image we have of these two sisters, the last moment we can point to and say with certainty, yes, they were here. They were alive, they were fine, is two girls standing in a concession line at a movie theater, waiting for popcorn, on a Friday night in December 1956. And then the intermission ended and the lights went back down, and the second screening of Love Me Tender began in the theater, filled again with the sound of Elvis Presley's voice, and sometime after that, the film ended, and the crowd filed out into the night, and Barbara and Patricia Grimes were in that crowd, and then they were gone. What happened between 9:30, when Dorothy left, and 11 o'clock, when the second screening ended, what the girls did during that time, whether they spoke to anyone, whether anyone approached them, whether anything happened inside that theater or on the street immediately outside it, is not known. What happened after 11 o'clock, after the second screening, when they walked out into the December night and the crowd dispersed, and each person went their separate way. That is the heart of the mystery. That is the place where the story breaks and becomes something else entirely. That is the question that has never been answered. Multiple witnesses, including the bus driver, would later report seeing the girls board a Chicago Transit Authority bus on Archer Avenue heading east, in the direction of their home, sometime after the screening ended. According to these accounts, and it is important to note that witness accounts in this case are numerous, frequently contradictory, and must be handled carefully, the girls rode the bus and exited at Western Avenue. That stop is approximately halfway between the Brighton Theater and their home on South Damon Avenue. Roughly a mile, give or take, from their front door. Why they would have gotten off there, in the dark, in the cold, with a mile still left to walk, is not known. It has never been explained satisfactorily. Perhaps they intended to walk the rest of the way and thought the cold was manageable. Perhaps someone on the bus said something to them. Perhaps someone they knew was getting off there, and they decided to walk with them for a stretch. Perhaps they were offered a ride from the stop, by someone they knew or someone they did not, and they made the decision that 12 and 15-year-old girls sometimes make on cold nights when a warm car is being offered and the person offering it seems safe enough. Perhaps. That is the word that governs everything that follows. Perhaps, maybe, possibly, allegedly. The vocabulary of a case that never found its floor, that never located the single solid piece of evidence that could support everything else. The vocabulary of an investigation that began with failure and accumulated more failure and left, in the end, almost nothing that anyone could build a prosecution on. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. On the night of December 20, 1956, none of that had happened yet. The investigation had not yet begun. The failures were still in the future. On South Damon Avenue, at the house with the amber windows, Loretta Grimes was waiting for her daughters to come home. Midnight came. The front door did not open. No footsteps on the porch, no voices in the hallway. The clock in the front room moved past 12, and the house was quiet in the particular way that houses are quiet when they are supposed to be full of people and are not. Loretta stood at the window and looked at the empty street and felt the specific fear that mothers carry in their bodies always. The fear that lives low and constant like a second heartbeat, always present, always ready to swell into something enormous the moment the world gives it a reason to. She called some of the girls friends. No one had seen them since the theater. She sent her daughter Theresa and her son Joey to the nearest bus stop to wait and watch for them. They went out into the cold and stood there, and the buses came and went, and Barbara and Patricia were not on any of them. They came back inside. The street was empty. The night was completely still. Loretta Grimes picked up the phone and called the police. And here, right here, in this moment, at this phone call, is where the first catastrophic failure of this entire case begins. The failure that set the tone for everything that followed. The failure that, some would argue, cost these girls whatever slim chance of survival they might have had if the window of time Harry Gloss later identified as possible was real. The officers who responded to Loretta's call told her that her daughters had probably run away. These things happened, they said. Teenage girls, the holidays, a Friday night out. They suggested she wait. They suggested she give it a little time. They told her, with the institutional confidence of people who believed they understood the situation better than the woman standing in front of them, that Barbara and Patricia would most likely turn up on their own. Loretta Grimes knew her daughters. She knew them the way a mother knows children she has carried in her own body and raised with her own hands and watched every single day of their entire lives. She knew the texture of their personalities and the shape of their characters and the specific way they moved through the world, and she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with wishful thinking and everything to do with 17 years of paying close attention, that these girls had not run away. She had not raised girls who would do this. She told the officers this, plainly and directly, without hysteria, with the quiet authority of a woman who knows what she is talking about. They did not listen to her. Joseph Grimes, the girl's father, would say it plainly in the Chicago Daily Tribune in the days that followed. I tried to tell police my daughters didn't run away, but they didn't listen to me. It was 1956. The default assumption built into the bones of law enforcement at that time was that a teenage girl who did not come home at night had chosen not to come home. That she was somewhere she was not supposed to be, with people she was not supposed to be with, and that when she was ready she would return. The idea that something could simply happen to a girl, something violent, something entirely outside her control or consent, was not where the official mind went first. Not automatically, not quickly enough. And so the hours passed. 1 day became 2, 2 became 3, and the flyers went up. The faces of Barbara and Patricia Grimes printed in black and white, stapled to telephone poles, and taped to the windows of storefronts along Archer Avenue and Damon Avenue, and every other street in the neighborhood that would take them. The family called everyone they could think of. They retraced the route to the theater. They talked to the theater staff. They knocked on doors and made phone calls and ran down every thread they could find. Nothing came back. And then the tips began, slowly at first and then faster, building into a flood that would become one of the most confounding and ultimately paralyzing features of this entire investigation. Because in the days and weeks that followed December 28th, people across Chicago began reporting that they had seen Barbara and Patricia Grimes. They were seeing them everywhere. They were seeing them constantly. And each sighting had to be followed up. Each account had to be checked. Each person who came forward with a claim had to be taken seriously, because any one of them might be the one that cracked the case open. Workers at a Chicago 5 and dime store, they had seen both girls on January 3rd, standing at a record counter with 2 young sailors, listening to Elvis Presley music. A cashier at the Clark Theater in downtown Chicago claimed she had spotted them at 12:45 in the morning on December 29th. The bus driver reported seeing them on Archer Avenue on the night of the 28th. A cab driver said he had seen them on December 30th at a diner on Madison Street, a stretch of the city that people then called Skid Row, a hard, transient stretch full of cheap hotels and all-night diners and men who passed through without names, sitting across from 2 men, one of whom had long sideburns like Elvis Presley. A woman traveling through the Midwest told authorities she had met both girls in a bus station restroom in Nashville, Tennessee on January 9th. She was absolutely certain. Her account made national newspapers. People began speculating that the Grimes sisters were on their way to Memphis to find Elvis himself. Elvis heard about it. He issued a public statement broadcast over national radio, addressed to his fans. If you are good Presley fans, he said, you will go home and ease your mother's worries. He was speaking to 2 girls who could not hear him anymore. Or perhaps, if Harry Gloss was right about the timeline, perhaps they could. Perhaps on the day Elvis made that broadcast, Barbara and Patricia Grimes were still somewhere, still breathing, still alive inside whatever darkness had swallowed them. Perhaps they heard his voice come through a radio in whatever room they were being held in, and felt something shift in their chests. Hope or grief, or simply the particular agony of hearing the voice of someone who represents everything that was good or no longer living. We do not know. We cannot know. That is one of the many unbearable things about this case. The things we cannot know and cannot stop imagining anyway. The Chicago Police Department eventually mobilized in full. What followed became the largest missing persons search in the recorded history of the city of Chicago. Thousands upon thousands of man-hours, hundreds of officers from multiple departments, volunteers and civilians and reporters all moving in the same frantic and increasingly exhausted direction. Signs appeared in the windows of stores across McKinley Park and the surrounding neighborhoods. Do not talk to strangers. Parents tightened their grip on their children's hands. The whole city was awake and watching and doing everything knew how to do. And it was not enough. It was not finding anything, because whoever had Barbara and Patricia Grimes, wherever they were, whatever was happening to them, was not leaving a trail that the city of Chicago, at full mobilization, could follow. Loretta Grimes made public pleas. She spoke to reporters. On January 11, 1957, With her daughter's nastigation producing nothing solid, she said, "If someone is holding them, please let the girls call me." She was reaching into the dark with open hands. She was a mother trying to find the exact right combination of words that might reach whatever person or persons were responsible in them. Mercy, guilt, fear, anything that would cause them to let her daughters come home. The darkness did not answer her. What answered instead, what came on the morning of January 2nd, 1957, was news of a different kind entirely. The kind of news that ends the hoping and begins the grieving. The kind of news that closes one chapter of a family's life and opens another one that will never really close. On that January morning, a man named Leonard Prescott was driving east along German Church Road, a quiet stretch of road near Willow Springs, a suburb southwest of Chicago, frozen fields on both sides, bare trees, the long gray silence of a deep Midwest winter pressing down over everything. He was driving carefully on the icy road. He glanced toward the embankment beyond the guardrail. Something was there. He thought for a moment that he was looking at mannequins. That is the word that appears in every account of this moment, mannequins. And it is a word that tells you something true about what the mind does when it encounters something it is not ready to accept. It reaches for an alternative. It reaches for the most benign possible explanation. It does not want to see what it is actually seeing. Leonard Prescott drove on. Then something in him would not let it go. He turned the car around. He went to his house first and collected his wife. He did not want to approach this alone. And together they came back to that stretch of German Church Road and looked over the guardrail and down onto the embankment below. What they saw were the bodies of two young girls, lying nude on the frozen ground, still, pale, completely exposed to the gray January sky. The snow around them was undisturbed, the road above was empty. The silence was the kind of silence that only exists in places where something completely, irreversibly wrong has happened. Leonard Prescott went for help. Law enforcement arrived within the hour. The scene filled quickly. Cook County Sheriff's officers, Chicago police, suburban departments, forensic personnel moving carefully across the frozen ground. Word reached the Grimes family. Joseph Grimes was driven to the embankment to make a formal identification. He looked over the guardrail. He confirmed that he was looking at his daughters. Barbara, 15 years old, the serious one. The one with the genuine smile and the plans and the homework always done before she was asked. Patricia, 12 years old, Petey, the electric one. The devoted fan. The one who made every room louder just by being in it. Both of them gone. Both of them on a frozen roadside in Willow Springs. 25 days after they walked out the front door on South Damon Avenue to go see their favorite singer at the Brighton Theater. 25 days after Loretta watched them put their coats on and said yes when some part of her had almost said no. 25 days. That is the number that lives at the center of this case like a stone. 25 days during which the entire city of Chicago turned itself inside out. 25 days of tips and sightings and press conferences, and a plea from Elvis Presley broadcast over the national airwaves, and a mother standing at windows and talking to reporters and reaching into the dark with open hands. 25 days during which someone knew exactly where these girls were and said nothing. Who was that person? What did they do? What were they hiding? And who were they protecting, and why? Why did a case that got this close to the truth so many times end without a single person ever being charged? Let me take you back to the exact moment the second screening of Love Me Tender ended at the Brighton Theater on the evening of December 28, 1956. Because this is where the confirmed story ends and the darkness begins, and I want you to feel the weight of that transition. I want you to understand in your body what it means for two girls to walk out of a warm, lit popcorn-scented theater into a December night in Chicago and simply never arrive home. The film ended sometime around 11 o'clock in the evening. The lights inside the Brighton Theater came up slowly, the way theater lights always do. That gradual return of brightness that pulls you back from wherever the story took you. That gentle insistence that the world outside the screen is real and waiting and requires your attention. The crowd began to move, seats creaked. Coats were retrieved from laps and pulled on. People shuffled toward the aisles in that particular unread way of movie theater crowds, everyone still slightly inside the story they just watched, not quite ready to be fully outside again. The lobby would have been warm. The kind of institutional warmth that comes from too many bodies in a contained space, from the heat of the projector and the popcorn machine, and the press of people moving through a corridor together. It would have smelled of butter and cigarette smoke and wet wool from the coats people had been wearing all evening, slightly damp from the cold outside. The sound would have been the low murmur of a crowd beginning to disperse, fragments of conversation, the shuffle of feet on a tiled floor, someone laughing at something someone else said, a child asking a question in a too loud voice and being shushed. The ordinary, unremarkable sound of people ending an evening and beginning the process of going home. Barbara and Patricia Grimes were somewhere in that crowd. Picture them. Barbara, 15, dark-haired, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly where she is going. Patricia beside her, or slightly ahead of her, Petey never quite content to simply follow, always slightly in front, always with some comment to make about what they had just seen. Already processing the film out loud the way she processed everything. Turning it over and examining it from every angle with the particular enthusiasm of someone who experiences things fully and cannot help sharing that experience immediately. They would have been talking. They were almost always talking when they were together. They walked out of the Brighton Theater into the night. The cold would hit them immediately. Not gradually, not slowly, immediately. With the full force of a Chicago December night that has had all day to deepen and settle and become more completely itself. The kind of cold that enters your lungs on the first breath and feels sharp, almost metallic, like breathing in something that has an edge to it. The kind of cold that makes you hunch your shoulders automatically, pull your coat tighter, drop your chin toward your chest as if making yourself smaller will help. The kind of cold that makes the street look hostile even when it is not. That turns ordinary familiar surroundings into something slightly less welcoming than they are in the daytime and the warmth. The street outside the Brighton Theater would have been lit by the theater marquee and the street lamps overhead, casting pools of orange and yellow light onto the pavement, leaving stretches of shadow between them. Other patrons from the screening would have been around them, the crowd filtering out in both directions, some heading toward parked cars, some toward the bus stop, some simply disappearing into the residential streets that radiated away from the theater in every direction, like the spokes of a wheel. Within 10 or 15 minutes of the screening ending, the street would have been largely quiet again. The crowd absorbed by the neighborhood, each person swallowed back into their own life, leaving the sidewalk to the cold and the lamplight and whoever remained. Barbara and Patricia remained. What they did in those first minutes after the theater let out is not precisely known. Whether they talked to anyone outside, whether anyone approached them, whether they stood for a few minutes in front of the theater the way people sometimes do after a movie, still inside the experience, not quite ready to start the journey home. Whether Patricia said something about Elvis that made Barbara laugh. Whether they were already moving, already heading for the bus stop on Archer Avenue, already folding themselves back into the routine of a Friday night coming to its end. What we know, or what multiple witnesses reported, including the bus driver, is that at some point after the screening ended, the Grimes sisters were seen at the bus stop on Archer Avenue. They boarded a Chicago Transit Authority bus heading east, toward their neighborhood. This much has been reported consistently enough that most investigators have accepted it as essentially accurate. The bus was heading in the right direction. It was the logical thing to do on a night that cold. The bus would have been warm inside, not comfortable exactly, not inviting in the way a home is inviting, but warm in the functional, institutional sense. The seats hard and the windows fogged and the overhead lights aflat, even white, that made everything look slightly washed out and tired. They rode the bus east along Archer Avenue. And then at Western Avenue they got off. This is the detail that has never been explained. This is the small, stubborn, maddening fact that sits at the center of the geographic mystery of this case, and refuses to yield to any fully satisfying interpretation. Western Avenue was approximately halfway between the Brighton Theater and their home on South Damon Avenue. There was still more than a mile left to walk. The temperature was brutal. The time was somewhere around 11 o'clock at night, late enough that the streets would have been largely empty, late enough that the ordinary daytime life of the neighborhood would have been completely shut down, late enough that two teenage girls walking alone on a Midwest December night would have been among the very few people on the sidewalk. Why did they get off there? People have been asking that question for nearly 7 decades, and no one has produced a definitive answer. One possibility is that they intended to walk the rest of the way home, that the bus fare had run out, or that the stop was the nearest one to a route they preferred to walk, or simply that they'd not think another mile in the cold was beyond them. 15 and 12 are ages at which the cold registers as an inconvenience rather than a danger, at which the body's confidence in its own resilience tends to outrun its actual limitations. Another possibility, and this is the one that most investigators have gravitated toward over the years, is that someone offered them a ride. Think about what that moment would have looked like. Two girls stepping off a bus at Western Avenue at 11 o'clock on a December night, the temperature somewhere around single digits or below, the street nearly empty, the walk home more than a mile through dark residential blocks. A car pulls up. Someone they know or someone who seems friendly enough, or someone who presents themselves in a way that does not trigger alarm, someone who perhaps tells them he knows their family, or that their mother sent him, or simply that it is too cold to walk and he is heading that way anyway, and it is no trouble at all. Two girls who are cold and tired and want to be home. Did they get into a car? The evidence, fragmentary, contradictory, incomplete as it is, suggests yes. Most investigators who have spent serious time with this case believe that Barbara and Patricia Grimes accepted a ride from someone at or near Western Avenue on the night of December 28, 1956. Whether that person intended them harm from the beginning, or whether the situation deteriorated into something none of them anticipated, is another question that has never been answered. But here is what I want you to feel for a moment. Here is what I want you to hold in your mind. It is 11 o'clock held. The street is empty. The nearest houses are dark, their windows black, their inhabitants asleep or nearly so, their front doors closed against the winter. There are no cell phones. There is no way for Barbara or Patricia to send a quick message to their mother to say they are running a few minutes late, to say that someone is giving them a ride, to say that everything is fine and they will be home soon. There is no record being made, in real time, of where they are or who they are with. They are just two girls on a street corner in the cold, making a decision about a ride home, the way people made such decisions every single day in 1956, because the world had not yet taught them, systematically and with enough repetition to make it stick, that strangers in cars on late night streets were something to be afraid of. They were children. They were cold. They wanted to go home. Whatever they decided in that moment, whatever calculation they made, however quickly or slowly, however confidently or with whatever small hesitation, it was the last decision they made as free people, the last moment before whatever came next, the last breath of ordinary life before the darkness that followed it. Now I want you to think about what the person on the other side of that decision looked like, because whoever took Barbara and Patricia Grimes from Western Avenue on the night of December 28, 1956, whoever it was, they were not visibly monstrous. They were not wearing their intentions on their face. They did not look like what they were. They looked like someone safe enough to accept a ride from on a cold night. They looked like someone who belonged in that neighborhood, on that street in that moment. They looked ordinary. They may have seemed kind or familiar or simply neutral, the kind of presence that does not set off any alarm, because nothing about it is jagged enough to catch on anything. This is one of the most disturbing truths about violent crimes committed against strangers. Not that the perpetrators are visibly different from everyone else, but that they are not. That they move through the world wearing the same face as ordinary people, shopping at the same stores, riding the same buses, standing on the same street corners. That the thing they carry inside them is invisible until the moment it is not. Whoever was in that car knew exactly what they were doing. Whoever offered that ride, if a ride was offered, if a car was involved, and the weight of the evidence suggests it was, had either planned what happened next, or had allowed something in themselves to take over in a way that required a certain kind of person to be capable of either calculation or catastrophic loss of control, either premeditation or the particular darkness that lives in certain people and waits for the right conditions. Both possibilities are horrifying. They are horrifying in different ways, but they are equally horrifying and equally real, and whoever it was has never been identified with enough certainty to bring them to justice, which means that the specific shape of their horror, planned or impulsive, stranger or someone the girls trusted, remains unknown. The night deepened. The streets of McKinley Park were empty and cold and dark. The bus that Barbara and Patricia had ridden east along Archer Avenue moved on without them, carrying its remaining passengers toward their own homes, their own warm kitchens, their own ordinary Friday nights concluding in the ordinary way. The theater marquee behind them went dark. The cold settled further into the street, into the pavement, into the bare branches of every tree lining every block between Western Avenue and South Damon Avenue. On South Damon Avenue, inside the house at number 3634, a clock moved past 11. Past 11:30. Toward midnight, Loretta Grimes was awake. She was awake the way wake when their children are not home. Not sleeping, not resting, not doing anything that could be called living normally. She was awake and waiting and listening for the sound of the front door, for the footsteps on the porch, for the voices in the hallway that would mean her daughters were home, and everything was as it should be. The house around her was quiet. The younger children were asleep. The night outside the windows was black and cold and utterly silent. The clock moved past midnight. The door did not open. At some point, we do not know precisely when, we do not know what the exact sequence of actions was. We only know the approximate shape of what Loretta did in those of December 29th. She began to move. She picked up the telephone and called the friends she could reach at that hour, the ones whose numbers she had, the ones whose family she knew well enough to call in the middle of the night without apology. Nobody had seen the girls. Nobody knew where they were. She sent Teresa and Joe to the bus stop to wait. They came back without having seen anything. She called the police. We have already spoken about what the police said when she called. We have already noted the failure of that first response, the assumption of runaway, the suggestion to wait, the institutional blindness that could not see past its own prejudices about teenage girls and Friday nights, and what it means when a daughter does not come home. But I want to spend a moment here, in this specific place in the story, thinking about what those early hours felt like for Loretta Grimes. Because the fear of a parent waiting for a child who does not come home is one of the most specific fears that exists. It has a particular texture. It is not the generalized, formless anxiety of someone worried about an unknown outcome. It is sharpened and focused and relentless, pointed directly at the silence where the sound of your child should be. Every minute that passes without that sound becomes heavier than the last. The mind goes to places you do not want it to go, and you pull it back, and it goes again, and you pull it back again. And the clock moves and the door stays closed, and the street outside stays empty, and the silence becomes something you can feel against your skin. Loretta Grimes sat with that silence all night, and while she sat with it, while she waited and prayed and told herself that they were fine, that there was an explanation, that the door was about to open, something was happening to her daughters that she could not know and could not stop and could not reach. We do not know exactly what that something was. We never have. The physical evidence that was eventually gathered, the condition of the bodies, the wounds, the findings that Harry Glaus fought so hard to bring to light, tells part of the story, but only part. It tells us that violence was done. It tells us that the girls did not die peacefully. It tells us that what happened to them in the time between Western Avenue and the embankment off German Church Road was terrible in the specific, intimate, deliberate way that only another human being can be terrible to another human being. but the specifics, the precise sequence of events, the exact location where they were held, the exact manner of their deaths, the number of people involved, those details remain locked inside the silence that began on December 28th and has never broken. What the physical evidence does tell us, through Harry Gloss's examination of the bodies, is something about the geography of their final days. The puncture wounds on Patricia's chest, small, precise, consistent with an ice pick driven into the skin with deliberate force. Multiple wounds. Not the result of an accident or a struggle deliberate. Chosen. The bruising and marks on Barbara's face and head. Blunt force, applied to the face. The kind of damage that speaks to either a very specific kind of violence or a very specific kind of rage, or possibly both at the same time. The evidence that both girls had been sexually assaulted. Evidence that Harry Gloss staked his career on, that he took to a press conference at his own home, when his superiors refused to acknowledge it. That cost him his position and did not cost the person responsible anything at all. And then there is the question of where they were held. If Harry Gloss was right, and there are serious investigators who believe he was, who have looked at the evidence with modern eyes, and concluded that the physical indicators were sound, then Barbara and Patricia Grimes were not killed on December 28th. They were kept somewhere, alive for days, possibly for weeks, while the city searched for them and found nothing, and while whoever held them went about the outward business of their life. Going to work, coming home, eating dinner, sleeping in a bed, living the ordinary life of an ordinary person, with two girls imprisoned somewhere. Where was that place? Nobody has ever been able to say with certainty. Chicago in 1956 was a city with a great many places where things could be hidden, basement rooms and back apartments and industrial spaces, and the kinds of locations that exist in every large city. Places that are technically occupied but functionally invisible. Places that people pass every day without ever thinking about what might be happening inside them. The city was also a city with a certain infrastructure of secrecy, back rooms and private arrangements, and the complex web of favors and protections that characterized the particular plickersdom of 1950s Chicago. That made the concealment of things and people more feasible than it might otherwise have been. The idea that two girls could be held somewhere in or near Chicago for weeks, while the entire city searched for them, strains belief. At first, it feels impossible. It feels like the kind of thing that could not happen without someone noticing, without some neighbor or passerby or delivery man seeing something that broke the surface of the secret. But history is full of cases we know about, cases that were eventually solved, in which exactly this kind of concealment took place for exactly this kind of duration, in which people were held in plain sight or close to it, while the world outside searched and failed to find them, in which the ordinary human tendency to see what we expect to see, and not to look too closely at what makes us uncomfortable, and to trust in the surface presentation of things, was exploited by someone who understood it very well. Whoever held Barbara and Patricia Grimes understood human behavior well enough to hide something enormous in plain for 25 days. That requires a certain kind of person, cold-controlled, capable of maintaining a normal external life while managing a private horror, capable of planning and executing the concealment not just for an hour or a day but for the entirety of a 3-week search by an entire metropolitan police department. That is not the behavior of someone who acted impulsively, who grabbed two girls on a cold street and panicked about what to do next. That is the behavior of someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who had perhaps done something like this before. Someone for whom this was not a departure from their normal pattern of behavior so much as an escalation of it. The days passed inside whatever space held them. The hours moved. Outside, the city searched. The flyers went up. Elvis Presley spoke over the radio. Loretta Grimes made her pleas to the press. Inside, the silence continued. At some point, and here the evidence becomes indirect, interpretive, dependent on readings of physical indicators that were themselves disputed, Barbara and Patricia Grimes died. Whatever the mechanism, however it happened. Whether the cold of wherever they were held contributed to it, whether the violence that left those marks and wounds on their bodies was what ultimately killed them, Whether they died together or separately, whether they knew it was coming or whether it arrived without warning, they died. Two sisters, 15 and 12, Petey and Barbara. The quiet one and the electric one. Gone. And then someone had to decide what to do with their bodies. This is another moment that tells you something about whoever was responsible. Because the decision to take the bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes and transport them to a specific location, a stretch of road in Willow Springs, a guardrail on German Church Road, a precise embankment that was far enough from the city to provide distance but close enough to be reached, that decision was not made in a panic. It was made with deliberation. Someone drove, or arranged for someone to drive, to that location. Someone carried or dragged the bodies over the guardrail and positioned them on the embankment. Someone chose that place specifically, or chose it opportunistically because they knew it was quiet, knew it was unlikely to have witnesses at whatever hour the decision was executed, knew the road and the guardrail and the frozen ground on the other side of it. Someone who knew the area. Someone who had reason to know that a stretch of road in Willow Springs, on the southwest edge of the Chicago suburbs, was a place where two bodies might lie undiscovered for at least a little while. They lay there. The January cold held them in place. The snow around them remained undisturbed. The road above was driven by dozens, or perhaps hundreds of cars in the days between whenever they were placed there, and the morning of January 22nd when Leonard Prescott drove past and thought he saw mannequins. Those cars passed without stopping. Their drivers looked at the road ahead and did not look over the guardrail and saw nothing unusual and drove on. It was Leonard Prescott's particular fate to be the one who looked. To be the one who could not let the image go. To be the one who turned around. And it was Loretta and Joseph Grimes's particular agony to receive the phone call that followed. I want to stay here for a moment, in the space between the discovery and what came next, because I think it is important to understand what that day, January 22nd, 1957, meant for the people who loved these girls. Not just the immediate horror of confirmation, of the knowledge that the hoping was over and the grieving had officially begun, but what came after. What Loretta Grimes carried out of that day and into the rest of her life. What Joseph Grimes carried. What Theresa and Shirley and Jimmy and Joey carried. The older sister who stood at the bus stop in the cold. The brothers who went looking for their sisters. All of them now living in a world from which Barbara and Patricia had been permanently removed. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from losing someone to violence that has never been explained or accounted for. It is not simply the grief of loss. That is devastating enough. That is a weight that people carry their entire lives, that never fully resolves no matter what anyone tells you about time and healing. It is grief compounded by injustice, by the unanswered question, by the knowledge that somewhere in the world, someone knows what happened and has chosen, every single day since, to keep it hidden. That the person who took your daughters is walking around free. That they may have done it again. That the city that failed to find your girls while there was still a chance is now failing to name the person responsible. That is what Loretta Grimes lived with. That is what the Grimes family lived with. Now let me tell you about the investigation that followed the discovery. Because the investigation, which should have been the moment when things began to come together, was instead the moment when they began to come apart. 160 officers and volunteers fanned out across the area around German Church Road in the hours after the discovery. They searched the embankment, the surrounding fields, the tree lines and brush, the ground on every side of the guardrail. They were looking for anything: footprints, a discarded piece of clothing, a weapon, a cigarette butt, any physical object that might carry a fingerprint or a fiber or a trace of something biological that could be connected to a specific person. They found almost nothing. No clothing belonging to the girls was recovered at the scene or anywhere else. The girls had been wearing their coats when they left the house on December 28th. Their winter coats and their shoes and their ordinary Friday evening clothes. None of it was ever found. Wherever those clothes went, whatever was done with them, they have never surfaced. The absence of the clothing was significant. It suggested not just that the bodies had been moved, but that someone had thought carefully about what to remove and what to leave, about what could be traced and what could not. It suggested again someone who was thinking, someone who was careful, someone who understood the mechanics of how investigations worked well enough to take precautions against them. The ground around the bodies had been frozen for long enough that whatever footprints or tire tracks might have existed when the bodies were placed there had been obliterated or rendered unreadable. The January cold that had held the bodies in place had also held any trace evidence in place, but in a way that made it impossible to extract meaningfully. The scene had been frozen in time, quite literally in a way that preserved form but destroyed function. The forensic tools available in 1957 were not what forensic tools are today. There was no DNA analysis. There was no ability to extract biological trace evidence from surfaces and run it against a database of known offenders. There was no digital footprint to trace, no phone records, no GPS data, no credit card transactions, no surveillance camera footage from a gas station on German Church Road that might have captured a license plate at 2 in the morning. The investigators who arrived at that embankment on January 22, 1957, were working with the tools of their era: physical evidence, witness testimony, fingerprints if they could get them, and the particular investigative intuition that comes from years of looking at crime scenes and learning to read what they say. The scene said very little, or rather, what it said was being interpreted differently by different investigators, and those different interpretations were about to collide very publicly and very destructively. The bodies were removed and transported for autopsy, and the autopsy, which should have been the moment when the physical evidence began to speak clearly, when the examination of the girls' bodies began to answer the questions the scene itself could not, instead became the fault line along which the entire investigation began to crack. The preliminary autopsy findings, presented by Cook County Coroner Walter McCarran's office, suggested death by exposure. Secondary shock from freezing temperatures, the conclusion. Stripped to its essentials, was that the girls had died of the cold, that they had been exposed to freezing temperatures for long enough that their bodies shut down. This was the official position. This was what was put on record. Harry Gloss looked at the same bodies and reached different conclusions. And what Gloss found, what he documented, what he fought to bring into the public record, tells a different and far darker story about the final hours of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. On Patricia's chest, he found the puncture wounds, multiple of them, small, precise, penetrating, the kind of marks left by a sharp, narrow instrument driven into the body with enough force to break the skin and go deeper. An ice pick was the comparison that kept being made, because in 1950s Chicago, an ice pick was a common household and bar tool, the kind of object that existed in every kitchen and behind every bar counter, the kind of object that could be obtained without any special effort, and that left a very specific kind of wound. The wounds on Patricia were not accidental. They were not the result of a fall or a collision with something in the environment. They were the result of deliberate, repeated penetration of the skin with a pointed instrument. Someone had done that to her. Someone had stood close enough to Patricia Grimes to do that to her body, and had done it more than once. On Barbara's face and head, Gloss found bruising and marks consistent with blunt force trauma. Her face had been struck, more than once, by the pattern of the injuries, hard enough to leave marks that were still visible on a body that had been exposed to freezing temperatures for an extended period. And beyond the specific wounds, Gloss found what he believed, what he was certain of, certain enough to stake his career on and lose it, was evidence that both girls had been sexually assaulted before their deaths. He was not uncertain about this. He was not hedging or speculating or offering it as one possibility among several. He was the chief investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office, a man with years of experience examining the results of violence done to human bodies, and he looked at what had been done Barbara and Patricia Grimes, and he was certain. He believed they had been raped. He believed the evidence of it was present in the autopsy findings, and that it was being suppressed, whether out of institutional cowardice, or out of a misguided desire to protect the reputation of the victims, or out of something more deliberate and more corrupt, by the official position of Walter McCarran's office. He also believed something else. Something that, if true, changes the entire shape of this crime. He believed Barbara and Patricia Grimes had not died on December 28th. He believed they had been held alive, somewhere, for a period of time after their disappearance. He believed the physical indicators, the condition of the bodies, the stage of decomposition, the specific markers that an experienced forensic investigator learns to read in the examination of the dead, told him that these girls had died recently. Not 3 weeks ago. Not on the night they disappeared from Western Avenue. Recently. Days before their discovery, perhaps less. If he was right, if that reading of the evidence was accurate, then on every single one of the 25 days between December 28th and January 22nd, while the city searched, while the tips came in, while Elvis pleaded over the radio and Loretta stood at windows and the flyers weathered on the poles, Barbara and Patricia Grimes were alive, alive somewhere in or near Chicago, held, waiting, perhaps still hoping that someone would find them, perhaps in those early days, still believing that someone was coming, perhaps as the days became a week and the week became 2, beginning to understand that no one was coming, that the door was not going to open, that the city that was searching so desperately for them was searching in all the wrong places, and the right place was somewhere nobody was looking, somewhere hidden inside the ordinary fabric of a city that had no idea what was being hidden inside it. That possibility, the possibility that they were alive for 25 days while the investigation failed to find them, is the most agonizing dimension of this entire case. It is the dimension that made Harry Gloss unable to let go of it even after he lost his job for saying it. It is the dimension that has made this case stick in the minds of everyone who has ever seriously examined it. It is the dimension that makes the institutional failures, the police who told Loretta to wait, the coroner who suppressed evidence, the investigators who let the Melquist lead go cold, feel not just like professional failures but like something closer to a moral catastrophe. Because if Harry Gloss was right, then the investigation did not simply fail to catch a killer after the fact. It failed to save 2 girls who were still alive. That is the wound at the center of this story. That is the thing that never heals. That is the question that has echoed through this case for nearly 7 decades, getting no quieter with time, no less sharp with distance. Were they still alive? For how long? What were those days like? Inside whatever darkness held them. We do not know, we will probably never know. But we owe it to Barbara and Patricia Grimes to keep asking, to keep looking, to refuse to let the silence that surrounded their disappearance become the silence that permanently defines their story. They were more than what happened to them. They were Barbara, who smiled because she was happy, and Patricia, who was electric and loud and devoted to something she loved with her whole heart. They were sisters who went to the movies together on a Friday night, because that is what they loved to do, and who were gone before the world had finished being what it should have been for them. They deserved better than what they got, from the night of December 28th, from the investigation that followed, from the city that searched and failed, from the institutions that fought each other instead of fighting for them. They deserved better, and the least we can do, the very least, is to keep saying their names. Barbara Grimes, gone on December 28, 1956, still waiting for justice. When the bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes were found on that frozen embankment off German Church Road on the morning of January 7, 1957. The city of Chicago exhaled in the particular way that cities exhale when a search that has consumed them finally reaches its conclusion, not with relief, because there was nothing relieving about what Leonard Prescott found when he looked over that guardrail, but with the grim, heavy settling of a truth that has finally stopped moving and become fixed. The not knowing was over. The hoping was over. What remained now was the work of understanding what had happened, and how to hold them accountable for it. That work fell, in the first instance, to the investigators and forensic personnel who arrived at the scene in the hours after the discovery. And what they found, or more precisely, what they found and what they could not agree on, and what they chose to tell the public and what they chose to suppress, would define the entire trajectory of the investigation that followed. It would determine which leads got pursued and which got abandoned. It would determine which suspects got serious attention and which were let go. It would determine, ultimately, whether the truth was ever going to come out, and the tragedy of the Grimes sisters' investigation, one of its many tragedies, is that the first and most fundamental disagreement was not between investigators and perpetrators. It was between investigators and each other. The scene at German Church Road, when law enforcement arrived in full, was processed with the resources available in January 1957. The embankment was searched thoroughly. The surrounding area was combed by over 160 officers and volunteers working in the January cold, moving through frozen brush and across hard ground, looking for anything that might constitute evidence. They were looking for footprints, tire tracks, discarded objects, any physical trace of the person or persons who had placed two young girls on that roadside and left them there. The search was exhaustive in terms of personnel and hours expended. It produced almost nothing of direct evidentiary value. No clothing was found. This was immediately significant. The girls had left home on December 28th dressed for a cold winter evening. Coats, shoes, the ordinary clothes of a Friday night out. None of those garments were recovered at the scene or in any subsequent search of the surrounding area. They have never been found. Their absence told investigators that the bodies had been deliberately stripped before or after being transported to that location. Someone had removed the clothing. Someone had made a decision about what to take away and what to leave behind. And that decision had been made carefully enough that nothing connected to the clothing has ever surfaced in almost 7 decades of searching. The ground itself was unhelpful in the way that deeply frozen ground is unhelpful. It preserved the surface configuration of things without yielding anything that could be analyzed or traced. If tire tracks had existed at the point of deposit, the repeated freezing and thawing of the weeks since had rendered them unreadable. If footprints had been left, they were gone. The physical scene had been sealed by winter into a form that looked informative from the outside, but was functionally empty. The bodies were removed and transported to the Cook County Coroner's Office for autopsy. And the autopsy, the examination that should have spoken clearly and authoritatively about what had happened to Barbara and Patricia Grimes, that should have provided the foundation on which the investigation could build, instead became the site of a conflict so damaging, so public, and so thoroughly corrosive to the investigation's integrity that its effects are still felt in discussions of this case today. On one side of that conflict stood Walter McCarran, the Cook County coroner. McCarran was an elected official, an important detail, because it means his position was not simply professional but also political, that his decisions were made in an environment where public perception and institutional relationships mattered alongside scientific accuracy. McCarran's office produced findings that concluded, at least in the initial assessment, that the girls had died of exposure, of secondary shock brought on by freezing temperatures. The official position, as McCarran presented it, was that there was no definitive evidence of fatal traumatic violence, that the cause of death was environmental, and that the case should proceed accordingly. On the other side stood Harry Gloss. Harry Gloss was the chief investigator for the coroner's office, McCarran's own investigator, the man whose job it was to examine evidence and report what he found, regardless of where it led or how uncomfortable it made anyone. He was, by all accounts, a formidable figure, broad-shouldered, direct, the kind of man who wore his fedora like a statement of intent, and who had spent enough years looking at the results of human violence to have developed very strong opinions about what evidence was saying when he examined it. His daughter, Renee Gloss Block, remembered him as a man who did not back down, as a tough son of a gun, in her words, who knew what he knew and was not interested in pretending otherwise. What Harry Gloss knew, after examining the evidence from the autopsies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes, was this. He knew that Patricia had puncture wounds on her chest. Multiple wounds, small and precise, the kind made by a narrow-pointed instrument, an ice pick, in the comparison that kept appearing in every discussion of the injuries. These wounds were not consistent with an accidental injury, or with the kind of trauma that occurs when a body is moved or exposed to the elements. They were deliberate. They had been made by someone who held that instrument and drove it into a 12-year-old girl's body more than once. That was not an accident. That was not exposure to cold weather. That was violence. Specific and chosen and repeated. He knew that Barbara had bruising and marks on her face and head that were consistent with blunt force trauma. Her face had been struck, more than once, hard enough to leave visible damage. Again, not consistent with exposure. Not consistent with an accidental death in a frozen field. Consistent with someone having her deliberately and forcefully in the face. He knew, or believed with a certainty he was prepared to defend publicly and professionally, that both girls had been sexually assaulted before their death. He examined the evidence and he drew his conclusion, and he was not uncertain about it. He had been doing this work long enough to know the difference between what he was seeing and what someone might prefer him to see. And what he was seeing was the evidence of rape. And he believed, based on the physical indicators available to him, the condition of the bodies, the specific markers that an experienced forensicator uses to estimate time since death, that Barbara and Patricia Grimes had not died on December 28th. He believed they had died much more recently, days before their discovery, not weeks. He believed they had been held alive somewhere after their disappearance, and that their bodies had been transported to German Church Road and placed there after their deaths. McCarran's office took a different view on the sexual assault findings in particular. The official position was that the evidence was either absent or inconclusive. That whatever Gloss believed he had found did not meet the threshold of certainty required to include it in the official findings. And here is where the human element of this dispute becomes relevant in a way that is uncomfortable but important. Renee Gloss Bloch, Harry's daughter, offered an explanation for why the coroner might have been reluctant to include those findings officially. She suggested that McCarran had suppressed the evidence of sexual assault not out of corruption or malice, but out of a misguided desire to protect the victims, to spare Loretta Grimes from knowing the full extent of what had been done to her daughters, to preserve the girls' reputations in a community, in an era where such things mattered enormously, where the sexual assault of a victim could be used, consciously or not, to shift a portion of the moral weight of the crime onto the victim herself. That instinct, to protect the dead from the full truth of what was done to them, is comprehensible in a human sense. It comes from a place that is not entirely cruel, but its effect, in this case, was to remove from the official record the evidence that most clearly indicated the nature of the crime and the kind of perpetrator the investigators should be looking for. It removed the evidence that pointed toward a sexual predator, someone who had targeted these girls specifically for the violence he intended to do, someone who should have been looked for in the registry of known sex offenders, in the records of similar crimes in the area, in the specific and identifiable pattern of behavior that sexual predators exhibit, and that experienced investigators can recognize and track. By suppressing that evidence, the official investigation lost its most important compass bearing. Harry Gloss decided he had reached his limit on February 14, 1957. On that day, he took a step that was professionally extraordinary and personally courageous in a way that cost him everything he had built in his career. He called a press conference, not at the coroner's office, at his own home, because by that point the relationship between him and McCarran had deteriorated to the point where using official facilities for his own press conference was not an option. He stood in front of reporters and he said, plainly and on the record, what he had found and what he believed. He said the girls had been sexually molested. He said the evidence supported it. He said the official position of the coroner's office was wrong. He said it knowing what it would cost him. McCarran responded the following day. He called his own press conference, and he fired Harry Gloss. Let that sit for a moment. The chief investigator of the Cook County Coroner's Office was fired for publicly stating what he believed the evidence showed in the most significant murder investigation the region had seen in years. He was fired not for being wrong, not because anyone produced a compelling counter-argument to his forensic findings, but for saying it out loud. For refusing to keep the finding inside the institutional walls, where it could be managed and minimized and eventually forgotten. The firing of Harry Gloss did not make the truth he was telling go away. It made it harder to act on. It removed from the active investigation the one person most committed to pursuing the evidence where it actually led. It sent a message to other investigators, to other officials, to anyone paying attention to the institutional dynamics of this case, about what happened to people who pushed too hard against the official position. And it left the investigation in the hands of people who were either unable or unwilling to follow the evidence that Gloss had identified. The public fallout from the Gloss-McCarran dispute was significant. It ran in the newspapers. It consumed the public conversation about the case at precisely the moment when that conversation should have been focused on finding the person responsible. Chicagoans who had been following the case through their morning papers were now reading not about a coherent investigation making progress toward a suspect, but about a public argument between the officials responsible for that investigation, each accusing the other of mishandling evidence, each presenting their position to reporters with the specific combativeness of men who have decided that being right publicly matters more than anything else. It was a disaster for the integrity of the investigation, and it was a disaster that could not be undone once it had begun. Meanwhile, the tips were still coming in. The witnesses were still coming forward. The investigation still needed to process an enormous volume of incoming information and extract from it whatever was actually useful. And the witnesses, the many, many witnesses who came forward in the days and weeks surrounding both the disappearance and the discovery of the bodies, presented their own extraordinary challenge. The sheer number of reported sightings of Barbara and Patricia Grimes in the weeks between December 28 and January 22 is one of the most confounding features of this case. People saw them everywhere. They saw them at record counters and in bus stations and at diners and on street corners across the city. Some of these sightings were clearly cases of mistaken identity. Two girls of roughly similar age and appearance glimpsed briefly in a public space, and the observer's mind, primed by weeks of newspaper coverage and the omnipresent images on flyers, completing the identification in a way that felt certain but was not. Some were probably honest errors made by sincere people who genuinely believed they had seen Barbara and Patricia and wanted to help. But some of the sightings are harder to dismiss. The bus driver who reported seeing the girls board his Archer Avenue bus on the night of December 28 was not a peripheral figure making a casual identification. He was a professional, someone whose job required him to observe the people who boarded his vehicle. And his account of seeing the Grimes sisters that night has been treated by most investigators as one of the more reliable pieces of testimony in the case. He saw them. He remembered them. His account placed them on Archer Avenue heading east, getting off at Western Avenue, at approximately 11 o'clock in the evening. Consistent with the timing of the second screening's conclusion, and with the other accounts of the girls' movements on that night, a young man named Roger Menard told investigators he had attended the same December 28 screening of Love Me Tender, that he had sat behind the Grimes sisters in the theater, and that he had interacted with them at some point during the evening. The nature and significance of that interaction, whether it was entirely innocuous or whether it contained elements that should have been pursued more aggressively, has been the subject of ongoing discussion among people who study the case. A friend of Barbara's named Judy Burrow reported that she had seen the sisters on December 29, the day after their disappearance, walking westward on Archer Avenue. A classmate of Patricia's named Catherine Borak said she had seen Patricia on December 29 as well, walking past a restaurant where Borak had been eating, accompanied by two unidentified young girls. The Clark Theater cashier placed both girls downtown at nearly 1 in the morning on December 29. Each of these accounts was followed up. Each of them produced something and then produced nothing. A thread that extended a short distance and then stopped. A man named Earl Zulk told investigators that on December 29 he had exchanged words with two girls near Lawrence and Central Park Avenues. He later concluded that the girls had been Barbara and Patricia, though he noted in a detail that stuck that they had been rude and abrupt with him. Rude and abrupt. Two girls who were described by everyone who knew them as friendly and well-mannered, being rude and abrupt to a stranger on a street corner. That detail has always been interesting to the people who study this case, because it suggests something about the state of mind of whoever those girls were, if they were Barbara and Patricia. It suggests girls who were frightened, or exhausted, or desperate not to engage with someone they did not want to engage with. It suggests girls who were not simply out on a voluntary adventure in the days after their disappearance, as the runaway theory would have required. And then there was the cab driver who said he had seen two girls matching the description of Barbara and Patricia at a diner on Madison Street on December 30th, sitting across from two men. One of the men, he said, had sideburns like Elvis Presley. That detail, the sideburns, the Elvis comparison, was the thread that led investigators to Edward Bedwell. Benny Bedwell, as he was known, was 21 years old at the time of the investigation, a drifter from Tennessee who had made his way to Chicago and was working sporadically as a dishwasher and at a factory. He had a brief and undistinguished history, a stint in the U.S. Air Force that had not lasted, a period working with a traveling circus, the kind of fragmented biography that belongs to young men who have not yet settled into anything permanent, and who move through the margins of cities without making much of an impression on any of them. He was picked up for questioning by Chicago investigators who had been pursuing the Madison Street diner lead. The combination of his approximate physical description and his association with that particular stretch of the city, making him a person interested in an investigation that badly needed one. He was questioned. Days passed. The pressure on investigators to produce a result was enormous and growing. The public was watching. The newspapers were printing something about the case every single day. The mayor and the sheriff and every public official with any connection to the investigation was aware that Chicago was waiting for an answer and was not going to wait patiently much longer. The institutional appetite for a resolution, for a name, for a confession, for the ability to stand at a podium and tell the city that the person responsible had been found, was immense. On January 27, 1957, after several days in custody, Edward Bedwell signed a confession. He admitted to killing Barbara and Patricia Grimes. He said he had an accomplice, a man he identified only as Frank. He described meeting the girls at a Madison Street tavern on January 7th, more than a week after their disappearance, and spending approximately a week with them in various hotels around the city. He said that on January 13th, when the girls resisted the men's sexual advances, he and Frank had knocked them unconscious and then driven them to the location where they were later found and left them there. "If I hadn't been drinking," he told the Chicago Daily Tribune, "I wouldn't have done what I'd done, and what I'd done I didn't do intentionally." The city breathed. The newspapers ran the story on every front page. The investigation had its man. The case appeared to be moving toward a resolution. Loretta Grimes did not believe a word of it. "Our girls came from a good home and were brought up in religious surroundings," she told reporters, with the particular quiet fury of a woman who has been presented with an insult dressed up as an explanation. Her daughters would not have spent a week in hotels with strange men. They would not have gone to a Madison Street tavern with men they did not know. They would not have done any of the things Bedwell's confession required them to have done. Because they were not those kinds of girls and she knew them, and she would not allow their names to be attached to a story that was not true, not even in death, not even with the official weight of a signed confession behind it. She was right to refuse it. The holes in Bedwell's account appeared almost immediately, and they were not small holes. They were structural. They undermined the entire edifice of the confession at its most basic level. The first and most fundamental problem was the timeline. Medical experts who reviewed the autopsy findings, including, prominently, Harry Gloss, whose own examination had led him believe the girls had died recently rather than on December 28, were asked to assess when Barbara and Patricia had actually died. The conclusion that came back was damaging to Bedwell's account. The physical evidence suggested the girls had died on or very close to December 28, the night they disappeared. Not on January 13th as Bedwell's confession required. Not after a week spent in hotels on Madison Street. On December 28th, the night of the movie. the night they walked out of the Brighton Theater. If the girls had died on December 28th, then everything Bedwell claimed about meeting them on January 7th and spending a week with them and killing them on January 13th was impossible. Not unlikely impossible. He was confessing to events that the physical evidence indicated could not have occurred. The second problem was Bedwell's own alibi. His factory time card, the simple, documentary record of when he had clocked in and out at his place of work, showed that he had been working on the night of December 28th. If the girls died that night, as the medical evidence suggested, Bedwell had an alibi for the time of their deaths. He was at work. His card showed it. Bedwell's defense attorney was categorical the confession had been coerced. His client, under days of sustained pressure in police custody, had told the investigators what they appeared to want to hear. He had signed a statement that was not true because he believed, or was made to believe, that signing it offered him some advantage, or because the alternative, continued interrogation, continued confinement. The relentless institutional weight of an investigation that had decided he was the answer was more than he was equipped to resist. Coarse confessions are not rare. They are not the product of exceptional circumstances. They are the product of circumstances that this case reproduced almost perfectly, a suspect in custody, under enormous pressure, in the midst of an investigation that desperately needed a result, being questioned repeatedly by investigators who may not have been consciously aware of how hard they were pushing to want it. On February 5, 1957, Edward Bedwell was released from custody on bond. He was never charged in connection with the murders of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. The confession collapsed and took whatever momentum the investigation had generated with it, leaving behind only the damage. The public spectacle of an apparent breakthrough turned out to be hollow, the further erosion of public confidence in the investigation, and the particular bitterness of investigators like Harry Gloss and Cook County Sheriff Joseph Lohman, who had believed Bedwell was connected to the case and found themselves watching him walk out the door. Gloss's daughter Renee recalled years later that the situation always bothered her father, that he was sure he had the right man, or at least a man with significant connections to what had happened, and did not like being proven wrong, or having the case close around Bedwell, and then reopen with nothing inside it. But the more important question, as Bedwell disappeared from the investigation, and the case began its long drift toward cold, was not whether Bedwell had been the right suspect. The more important question was what had actually happened, what the evidence, read clearly and without institutional interference, was actually saying about who had killed these girls and how and when. And that question led, again and again, to the physical evidence, to the wounds on Patricia's chest, to the bruising on Barbara's face, to the evidence of sexual assault that Harry Gloss had lost his career for stating, to the timeline question. The fundamental dispute about when these girls had actually died, a dispute that has never been fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction, and that sits at the center of the case to this day. Because if the girls died on December 28th, if the medical experts who concluded death occurred at or near the time of disappearance were correct, then the investigation's central task was to determine what happened on the night of December 28th, after Western Avenue, between 11 o'clock and whenever death occurred. The window was small. The perpetrator was someone who had access to those girls on that specific night, at that specific location, and who had the means and the opportunity to do what was done to them in a compressed time frame. But if Harry Gloss was right, if the girls had been alive for some portion of those 25 days, then the investigation needed to think much bigger. It needed to consider who in the city of Chicago had the means and the infrastructure to conceal 2 girls for weeks, who had access to a space that could be kept secret, who had the kind of connections, or the kind of protection, that could insulate them from discovery during a citywide search. That is a different kind of perpetrator. That is someone with resources, with planning capacity, with ties to the kind of institutional or semi-institutional world where things can be hidden because the right people are not looking. Both readings of the evidence pointed towards something that the investigation was not, ultimately, able to pursue with the rigor it required. For different reasons, in different ways, The investigation kept getting close to something and then pulling back. Leads developed and then stopped developing. Names emerged and then retreated. The case accumulated suspects the way a cold river accumulates leaves, briefly on the surface, and then they were gone. Max Flig was one of those names. A 17-year-old. He was brought in by investigators and persuaded to take a polygraph examination. During that examination, he allegedly made statements that were interpreted as a confession to involvement in the crime. Whatever those statements actually contained, whatever their precise nature and meaning, they did not survive the process of formal investigation. Flig was not charged. The thread was picked up and then set down again. He moved through the case like a figure glimpsed at the edge of a photograph, present identifiable, and then gone before anyone could get a clear picture of what he actually represented. Barry Cook was another name, another person connected to the case through various threads of circumstantial evidence, brought into the investigation's orbit, and then released without charge. His name would appear again later, in the most disturbing and revealing detail of this entire investigation. It would appear in a phone call made to Loretta Grimes by a man who knew things about this case that no ordinary member of the public should have been able to know. But we are not there yet. Before the phone calls, before the name that keeps reappearing at the edge of this story like a shadow that refuses to resolve into anything solid, before all of that, there is the matter of the investigation's institutional failure. Not just the Gloss-McCarran dispute, not just the Bedwell debacle, but the systemic, structural failure that allowed a case of this magnitude, a case that consumed the city of Chicago for months, a case that generated more investigative effort and more public attention than almost any other crime in the history of Cook County, to go cold. Why did it go cold? Not because the investigators stopped working. Not because the public stopped caring. Not because the evidence was insufficient to point in any direction. The evidence was pointing. Harry Gloss knew where it was pointing. Several investigators who came after him, who reviewed the files and followed then left hanging, knew where it was pointing. It went cold because something kept pulling the investigation back whenever it got close. Something or someone. The city of Chicago in 1956 was not simply a place. It was a system, a complex, layered, thoroughly interconnected system of political machinery and organized crime infrastructure and Catholic institutional influence and neighborhood power structures that operated alongside and frequently in close relationship with the official apparatus of law enforcement. The Chicago machine was not a metaphor. It was a reality that every investigator working in the city understood, that shaped what was possible and what was not possible, that determined which investigations were allowed to go where, and which were quietly redirected before they arrived somewhere inconvenient. Ray Johnson, the retired police officer who has spent years studying the Grimes case, has spoken directly about this. He has talked about what he found when he pulled on the threads that the original investigation left hanging, the connections to organized crime, the connections to the political machine, the connections to individuals who had every reason to want certain things to stay buried, and who had the relationships necessary to make sure they did. He has said plainly that somebody still does not want this case to be solved. That is a serious statement. It is not a statement made lightly or without basis. It is a statement that emerges from years of research by a man who spent his professional life in law enforcement and who knows what institutional resistance looks like when he encounters it. And when you look at the arc of the investigation, at the firing of Gloss, at the Bedwell debacle, at the way leads kept developing and then stopping, at the way certain names kept appearing and then disappearing before they could be fully examined, it is hard to look at all of that and conclude that what you are seeing is simply the natural result of an investigation that's and ran out of leads. It looks like something else. It looks like a case that knew where it was going and was prevented from getting there. That is what we are going next part of this story. The suspects, the real ones. The name that belongs to a man who was convicted of killing another girl in a location near where the Grimes sisters were found, whose apartment contained a list of girls from the McKinley Park neighborhood, whose name appears in the files of this investigation and was then set aside in a way that has never been adequately explained. The mob connections. The phone calls that Loretta Grimes received, two of them years apart, from a voice she believed was the same voice both times, a voice that told her things that only the person responsible could have known. The investigation failed Barbara and Patricia Grimes. That is a fact. It failed them when they were alive and might have been saved. It failed them after their deaths, when the evidence of what had been done to them was suppressed to protect their reputations. It failed them when the false confession was pursued, and then collapsed and took the investigation's momentum with it. It failed them in ways that were accidental and in ways that may have been something much more deliberate. But the story is not over. The case is still open. There are still people working it. Still researchers pulling on threads, still investigators who grew up in that neighborhood and who have spent their lives refusing to let the silence become permanent. Every investigation has a moment where it has to make a choice. A moment where the evidence has accumulated enough to point in a direction. Where the threads have been pulled long enough that some of them are starting to lead somewhere real. And the investigators standing at that crossroads have to decide, do we follow this where it is actually going, or do we follow it where we need it to go? Those are not always the same place. In fact, in the most complicated and politically fraught investigations, they are almost never the same place. And the choice made at that crossroads, the decision about which direction to walk, determines everything that follows. It determines which suspects get serious attention and which get dismissed. It determines which evidence gets preserved and which gets explained away. It determines, ultimately, whether justice is served or whether it is something else that gets served instead, something that looks like justice from the outside, but has a completely different interior. The investigation into the murders of Barbara and Patricia Grimes reached that crossroads multiple times, and multiple times it made the wrong choice. Or the choice was made for it, by forces that operated above the level of individual investigators, and outside the boundaries of what anyone involved in the case was willing to say publicly. Let me take you through the suspects. All of them. The ones who looked guilty and were not. The ones who confessed to things they did not do. The ones who should have received far more attention than they did, and who instead moved through the investigation like figures moving through fog, visible for a moment and then gone, swallowed back into the ordinary world, leaving only the fading impression of their presence behind. Let us start where the investigation started, when it finally started seriously. Let us start with the diner on Madison Street in the Chicago of 1956. It was not a place that people in the respectable working-class neighborhoods of McKinley Park and Brighton Park thought of with any warmth. It was the city's Skid Row, a long, unforgiving stretch of cheap hotels and pawn shops, and all-night diners and taverns that opened early and closed late, and served the men who passed through the city's margins without roots or permanent addresses. It was not a criminal district in the organized sense. It was not the domain of the mob or the gangs who controlled other parts of the city. It was simply the place where the untethered went, the drifters, the men between jobs and between lives, who slept in the cheap hotels and ate in the diners and moved through the city without leaving much of a trace. It was into this world that the cab driver's sighting placed Barbara and Patricia Grimes on December 30, 1956, 2 days after their disappearance, sitting in a diner on Madison Street with two men. One of the men, the driver said, had sideburns that reminded him of Elvis. This detail, the sideburns, the Elvis connection, sounds almost too neat when you hear it. Two girls who had disappeared after seeing an Elvis movie, now allegedly spotted with a man whose sideburns evoked the singer who had been their idol. It sounds constructed. It sounds like the kind of detail that finds its way into a story, because someone needs it there, because it creates a connection where the investigation desperately needs connections. And it is possible that is exactly what it was, a detail that a witness, primed by weeks of newspaper coverage about Elvis, loving girls who had gone missing, unconsciously imported into his recollection of two girls he had seen at a diner, supplying the Elvis connection because his brain had been trained to look for it. but it is also possible it was real. And in an investigation where real evidence was in desperately short supply, even a possibly real detail had to be followed. The detail led to Edward Bedwell. We have already walked through the broad outlines of the Bedwell story, the pickup, the interrogation, the confession, the collapse. But I want to spend more time here, inside the details of what Bedwell actually said, and what it revealed about the pressure the investigation was under. Because the Bedwell episode is not simply a story about a false confession. It is a story about what happens to an investigation when the institutional need for a result overwhelms the investigative commitment to the truth. It is a story that repeats itself in different forms throughout the history of this case, and understanding it fully is essential to understanding everything that came after. Edward Bedwell was not a sophisticated man. He was 21 years old, with a background that had not provided him with the education, or the resources, or the social capital that would have allowed him to navigate the situation he found himself in with any real confidence. He had been a circus worker. He had done a brief stint in the Air Force that had not led anywhere. He was working in Chicago as a dishwasher and at a factory, the kind of marginal employment that characterizes a young man who has not yet found whatever is going to anchor him. He was not connected. He did not have a lawyer immediately available. He did not fully understand, in all likelihood, the precise legal dimensions of the situation he was in, or the specific rights that accrued to him in that situation. He was brought in for questioning, and he was questioned for days. Not hours, days. In the charged atmosphere of a case that had consumed Chicago for weeks. In a police environment that was under enormous public and institutional pressure to produce an arrest. In a building full of investigators who had been working this case through the holidays and into the new year, and who believed, with varying degrees of certainty, that the young man sitting across the table from them was connected to what had happened to two girls from McKinley Park. And on January 27th, after several days of this, he signed a confession. His attorney said it was coerced. The timeline the confession described was medically impossible. His factory time card contradicted the key elements of his account, and yet he signed it, and in signing it, he gave the investigation and the public and the city of Chicago what they had been waiting for nearly a month. He gave them a name. He gave them an explanation. He gave them the ability to believe, for a few days at least, that the thing that had happened to Barbara and Patricia Grimes was understood and contained and would be accounted for. It lasted less than 2 weeks. When the confession collapsed, when the medical impossibility of its timeline became impossible to ignore and Bedwell's factory alibi was confirmed and his attorney's assertions about coercion gained traction, the investigation did not simply return to where it had been before the confession. It returned to a worse place. The public spectacle of an apparent breakthrough that proved hollow had damaged the investigation's credibility. The investigators who had pursued Bedwell most aggressively were now in the difficult position of having pushed hard for a result that turned out to be wrong. The institutional pressure to find another suspect was now even more intense than it had been before, but the investigation's resources and credibility had both been depleted by the Bedwell episode in ways that were not easily replenished, and Harry Gloss was gone. Fired the same week that the Bedwell situation was unraveling, his departure removing from the active investigation the person most committed to following the physical evidence where it actually led, leaving behind a landscape of competing theories and disputed findings and institutional resentments that made coherent forward movement extremely difficult. Into this landscape walked a series of other names. Other men who moved through the investigation's orbit for varying periods of time, and then moved back out of it, each leaving behind a residue of possibility that never quite solidified into something actionable. Max Fligg was 17 years old. He was, by the standards of the investigation's suspect pool, an unusual figure, young local, not a drifter or a transient but someone from the community itself, someone who had grown up in the same general world as the Grimes family. The circumstances under which he came to investigators' attention are not entirely clear from the available record. What is clear is that he was brought in that investigators persuaded him to submit to a polygraph examination, and that during the course of that examination, or in connection with it, or in the questioning that surrounded it, he made statements that investigators interpreted as indicating knowledge of or involvement in the crime. A polygraph is not a truth machine. This is important to understand, and it was understood in 1957 perhaps less clearly than it is today. A polygraph measures physiological responses, changes in heart rate and blood pressure and skin conductance, that are associated with the stress of deception. It does not measure deception directly, it measures stress. And stress can be produced by many things besides lying: by fear, by anxiety, by the particular terror of being a 17-year-old in a police interrogation room in the middle of a murder investigation, being asked questions about the worst thing that has happened in your city in years. A polygraph administered in that environment, to a subject in that state, is not producing reliable data about guilt or innocence. It is producing data about fear. Whatever Fligg said during or around the polygraph examination, it did not hold up to scrutiny. He was not charged. He moved back out of the investigation's immediate focus. But his name remained in the file, one of many names that the investigation had touched and then set down without resolution. Part of the accumulated weight of inconclusiveness that the case was building around itself like a shell. Barry Cook is another name in that file. He appears in the record of the investigation as someone who was considered, questioned, and ultimately released without charge. A figure who occupied the investigation's attention for a period, and then receded. His connection to the case was circumstantial, built from threads that led somewhere but not far enough to constitute anything like prosecutable evidence. He was part of the landscape of suspicion that the investigation inhabited without ever fully mapping. What makes Barry Cook's name significant? What lifts it above the level of an ordinary investigative dead end and gives it a particular weight in the context of the story is not anything that happened during the active investigation in 1957. It is something that happened later. Something that arrived at Loretta Grimes's door in the form of a phone call. A phone call that changed the shape of the entire case. That pointed toward a person who knew the investigation from the inside. Who knew the names that had been developed and the leads that had been followed. Who knew far more than any ordinary member of the public should have been able to know. But we are not there yet. Before the phone calls, there is one more name that needs to be examined carefully. One more figure who moved through this investigation's orbit, and who represents, for many of the people who have studied this case most seriously, the closest thing to a real answer that the available evidence provides. That name is Charles Melquist. Charles Melquist was a suburban Chicago man, not a drifter, not a transient, not someone from the margins of the city's social world in the way that Bedwell had been. He was a resident of the suburban area southwest of Chicago, the same general geographic region where the bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes had been found. He was a man who existed within the ordinary fabric of suburban Chicago life, not invisible, not notably strange, not the kind of person who would automatically attract attention. He was the kind of person who moves through a community without making waves, who is known to his neighbors in the superficial way that suburban neighbors know each other, who has a face that people recognize without necessarily being able to attach a great deal of specific information to it. He was also, as it would emerge in 1958 and 1959, a killer. On a November day in 1958, the nude body of a 15-year-old girl named Bonnie Leigh Scott was found in a wooded area in the southwest suburbs of Chicago. She had been murdered. The location where her body was found was a few miles from the location where the bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes had been discovered nearly 2 years earlier. The similarity in the circumstances, a young girl nude, found in a wooded or semi-rural area on the southwest side of the Chicago metropolitan region, was immediately apparent to investigators who were familiar with the Grimes case. And it was apparent not just as a geographic coincidence, but as a possible pattern. The kind of pattern that emerges when the same person does the same kind of thing more than once. Charles Melquist was identified as the suspect in the murder of Bonnie Leigh Scott. He was arrested, investigated, prosecuted, and convicted. He was found guilty of her murder in 1959 and sentenced to prison, where he eventually died. When investigators searched his apartment in connection with the Bonnie Leigh Scott case, they found something that connected him, or appeared to connect him, to the Grimes sisters. They found a list. A handwritten list of girls' names. Not a short list. Not a list with obvious organizational purpose. Not the kind of list that has an innocent explanation readily available. A list of girls' names, including names of young women from the McKinley Park neighborhood, the same neighborhood where Barbara and Patricia Grimes had grown up, the same neighborhood where their family lived at 3634 South Damon Avenue, the same neighborhood whose streets they had walked all their lives. Their names were on that list. Let that register for a moment. In the apartment of a man who was convicted of murdering a 15-year-old girl in a wooded area near where the Grimes sisters had been found, there was a handwritten list of girls' names that included names from the Grimes sisters' neighborhood. Charles Melquist had been cataloging girls. He had been keeping a record of them, of who they were, where they lived, which neighborhood they came from. He had been doing the kind of quiet, deliberate, patient research that a certain kind of predator does when they are selecting targets, when they are thinking carefully and in advance about who their next victim will be. Investigators questioned Melquist about Barbara and Patricia Grimes after the list was found. They asked him about the Grimes case. They sat across from him, and they asked the questions that the list seemed to demand. And then, and here is where the failure becomes almost incomprehensible, where the inadequacy of the investigation's response to this lead becomes the hardest thing in this entire story to understand, they let it go. The questioning was brief. It produced no formal conclusion. The Melquist lead, which should have been one of the most intensively pursued lines of inquiry in the entire case, was picked up and then set down again without the kind of serious, sustained, multi-resource investigation that the circumstances clearly called for. Why? That question does not have a simple answer, and never has, and the answers that have been suggested over the years by Ray Johnson and other researchers who have spent serious time with this material are not comfortable ones. Ray Johnson believes that Charles Melquist was connected to people who had the capacity to limit how far the investigation into his potential role in the Grimes case would go. Not necessarily people who knew what Melquist had done and chose to protect him out of loyalty or affection, but people who were connected to him through the complex web of relationships, political, criminal, institutional, that characterized Chicago and its suburbs in the 1950s, and who had both the motivation and the means to make sure that certain lines of inquiry did not get followed to their natural conclusions. The Chicago of 1906 and 1907-1958 was, among other things, a city with a well-documented and extensively studied relationship with organized crime. The influence of the mob in Chicago during this period was not confined to obvious criminal enterprises, gambling, prostitution, the movement of contraband. It extended into politics, into law enforcement, into the courts, into the machinery of city and county government in ways that are now extensively documented and that were, at the time, both well known and largely unaddressed. The machine that ran Chicago did not distinguish neatly between its legitimate and illegitimate components. They were integrated, they functioned together. And the protection that the machine could provide, the ability to make a problem disappear, to redirect an investigation, to ensure that a particular thread was not pulled too hard, was available to people who had the right connections. Whether Melquist had those connections directly, or whether he benefited from them at a remove, through someone else, through an association that was itself connected to the people who could make things go quiet, is something that has never been definitively established. What has been established, or at least what the evidence strongly suggests, is that the investigation into Melquist's potential role in the Grimes case was not pursued with the energy and resources that the circumstances demanded, and that the failure to pursue it more aggressively is not fully explained by the ordinary limitations of investigative capacity or the ordinary challenges of putting a case against a difficult suspect. Something made the investigation stop. Something redirected it. Something ensured that the name Charles Melquist, which should have been at the center of the Grimes investigation from the moment the list was found in his apartment, remained at its periphery, visible noted, and then left alone. Johnson has spoken about this at length. He has talked about the links he found between Melquist and people who were connected to the Chicago mob. He has talked about the way those connections would have operated in the context of a 1950s Chicago investigation, not through explicit orders or direct interference, necessarily, but through the kind of ambient pressure that well-connected people exert simply by being well-connected, through unspoken understanding that certain things are better left alone, through the subtle recalibration of priorities that happens when investigators understand, without anyone having to say it directly, that pushing in a particular direction is going to create problems, that pushing in other directions would not. He has also talked about something else, something that speaks to the particular character of this case, and the particular darkness of whoever was responsible. Something that goes beyond the failure of investigation and into the active concealment of guilt by the person who carried it. He has talked about the phone calls, 2 phone calls, both made to Loretta Grimes, both she believed from the same voice, separated by nearly 2 years, but connected by something that cannot be explained by coincidence or by the ordinary mechanics of a stranger inserting themselves into a case they had read about in the newspapers. The first call came in 1957, not long after the investigation had stalled, not long after the Bedwell confession had collapsed, had been fired, and the case had begun its drift toward cold. The telephone rang in the Grimes house on South Damon Avenue, and Loretta picked it up, and the voice on the other end told her something that only one category of person could have known. He told her that he was the one who had undressed her daughters. Think about what that means. Think about the specific nature of that claim. The girls had been found nude. That fact was publicly known. It had been reported in the newspapers. It was part of the public record of the case. But the act of undressing them, the deliberate removal of their clothing, the decision to take their coats and their shoes and their ordinary Friday evening clothes and dispose of them somewhere they have never been found, that was an act performed by a specific person in a specific place at a specific time. The person who did that knew that they had done it. No one else in the world knew it from personal experience. Anyone else who mentioned it was drawing on public information. But this caller was not drawing on public information. He was claiming personal experience. He was claiming authorship. He was telling Loretta Grimes that he was the one who had stood over her daughters and removed their clothing. And he was telling her this because he wanted her to know. Because the knowing was part of it. Because whatever satisfaction he derived from what he had done was not complete until someone who loved the victims understood that he was responsible and that he was free, and that there was nothing anyone was going to do about it. That is not the behavior of a man who is consumed by guilt. That is not the behavior of someone who made a terrible mistake and cannot live with it. That is the behavior of someone who feels entitled to their crime. Someone who has processed what they did in a way that left them not diminished by it, but elevated. Someone who feels that the getting away with it is its own form of power, and who wants that power witnessed by the person most devastated by it. Loretta Grimes reported the call. An attempt was made to trace it or identify the caller. Nothing came of it. The second call came in 1959. The specific timing of it is important. It came on the same night that newspapers reported the discovery of Bonnie Leigh Scott's body, the 15-year-old girl found in the southwest suburban woods, murdered in circumstances that bore a striking resemblance to the Grimes case. On that night, with that news fresh in the public awareness, the telephone rang again in the Grimes house. The same voice. Loretta was certain it was the same voice. She had carried the sound of that first call inside her for 2 years, and she recognized it immediately. This time, the caller said he had gotten away with another one. And then he said something that revealed the depth of his knowledge of the investigation. He said the police were not going to be able to pin this one on Bedwell or Barry Cook. Bedwell, Barry Cook. 2 names from the Grimes investigation. Names that had been developed internally. Names that had been part of the investigative process. Names that were in the files. Not names that a random member of the public following the case through newspaper coverage would necessarily have known. Not names that anyone outside the investigation's inner workings would have had obvious access to. Names that this caller knew specifically, knew in the context of the investigation, knew well enough to reference them as the police's alternative suspects in a new murder case. This caller had access to the investigation. Whether that access was direct, whether he had been inside the process in some capacity, as a witness or a peripheral suspect or someone with connections to law enforcement, or whether it was indirect, obtained through someone who was inside the process is not known. What is known is that he knew things that he should not have been able to know if he was simply a member of the public following a cold case through the newspaper. He was not a member of the public. He was the person responsible, and he was calling to make sure that Loretta Grimes knew it, and knew that he was free, and knew that the system that was supposed to find him and hold him accountable had failed and was going to continue failing. The call was reported. Again, nothing came of it. Ray Johnson, in his research, has focused on Charles Melquist as the most likely source of those calls. Melquist had been questioned about the Grimes case. He knew the names that investigators had developed. He had been in the orbit of the investigation long enough to have accumulated that kind of specific knowledge. He had demonstrated through the existence of the list in his apartment that he had been thinking carefully and specifically about girls from the McKinley Park neighborhood, which means he had been paying attention to that world, to the people in it, in a way that went far beyond casual awareness. And he had murdered Bonnie Leigh Scott in circumstances sufficiently similar to the Grimes case that investigators immediately made the connection. If Melquist made those calls, and the circumstantial case for it is substantial, then those calls tell us something important about him. They tell us he was not simply someone who had stumbled into a terrible act and was trying to move past it. He was someone who was proud of what he had done. Someone who wanted acknowledgement. Someone who experienced the suffering of the people left behind not as a consequence to be regretted, but as a satisfaction to be savored. That profile, the predator who maintains contact with the investigation, who inserts himself into the aftermath of his crime, who wants to be known even as he avoids being caught, is not unfamiliar in the literature of violent crime. It is the profile of someone who has a specific relationship with their crimes. A relationship that does not end when the crime does, but that continues. That requires ongoing attention. That is fed by the awareness of how the crime is being understood and investigated, and felt by the people it has destroyed. The fact that Charles Melquist was convicted of murdering Bonnie Leigh Scott and died in prison should not obscure the fact that he was never charged with the murders of Barbara and Patricia Grimes. He died without being held accountable for what, based on the available evidence, a substantial number of serious investigators believe he did. He carried whatever he knew by December 28, 1956, and the days that followed it, to his grave. And whatever he carried with him into that grave is still there, unreachable, locked inside a history that the investigation failed to fully excavate, while he was still alive and could have been made to answer for it. But there is a piece of this story that sits even beneath the Melquist connection, a layer of this case that goes beyond the individual perpetrator and into the question of why the investigation failed as comprehensively as it did. Because Melquist, if he was responsible, did not operate in a vacuum. He did not evade justice simply through his own cleverness or through the ordinary difficulty of building a case against a careful criminal. The investigation was actively, demonstrably impeded by the Gloss-McCarran dispute, by the Bedwell episode, by the failure to pursue the Melquist-Leavely after the list was found, by the institutional pressures that shaped what the investigation was and was not allowed to do. Someone helped this case stay cold. Not necessarily by making a single decision or taking a single action, but through the accumulated effect of many small decisions, many redirections, many moments where the investigation arrived at the edge of something and was turned away from it. That is the Chicago machine. That is what it looked like in practice, in a specific and devastating case when it chose to protect something rather than expose it. Not dramatically, not visibly, quietly. bureaucratically through the ordinary mechanisms of institutional power, applied to an investigation that had gotten uncomfortably close to something that someone wanted left alone. And the people who paid the price for that, the people who paid the full, irreversible, permanent price, were Barbara and Patricia Grimes, 15 and 12, dark-haired and electric, gone since December 28, 1956, never given justice, never given the accounting that their deaths demanded, and that the system that was supposed to provide it declined to deliver. The case is still open. The Cook County Sheriff's Office has maintained that it is still an active investigation, that detectives still work it when leads come in. This is technically true. Whether it means anything meaningful, whether there is genuine institutional commitment to finding an answer, or whether the case's official openness is simply the administrative reality of a file that was never formally closed, is a question that nobody in a position of authority has answered satisfactorily. What we know is that the most likely suspect is dead, that the window for a traditional prosecution has been closed for decades, that the witnesses who were alive in 1957 are mostly gone, that the physical evidence that existed then was handled imperfectly and stored imperfectly, and may or may not yield anything useful to modern forensic methods. And we know that somewhere, in the records that still exist, in the files that have been maintained, in the documents that researchers like Ray Johnson have spent years excavating, there may still be something. Some piece of the picture that has not yet been fully examined. Some connection that has not yet been fully drawn. Some thread that leads somewhere real if someone is willing to pull it hard enough and keep pulling. Because the truth does not disappear. It does not dissolve into nothing simply because the investigation that should have found it failed to do so. It sits somewhere in the record of what happened, in the testimony of witnesses who may still be alive, in the physical evidence that modern science might be able to read ways that 1957 science could not. It waits. The way truth always waits when it has been buried rather than confronted, patiently, without urgency, available to whoever is willing to go far enough to find it. The question is whether anyone is still willing to go that far. That question has an answer, and the answer involves a retired detective who grew up in that neighborhood. A man who was a small child when Barbara and Patricia Grimes disappeared, who grew up in the shadow of what happened to them, who chose law enforcement as a career, and who eventually chose to spend a portion of that career trying to do what the original investigation had failed to do. James Hennigan grew up in McKinley Park. He was a small boy when Barbara and Patricia Grimes disappeared, young enough that the case reached him not as a news story but as something that changed the atmosphere of his neighborhood. The way adults spoke in lower voices, the way mothers held their children's hands differently, the way the streets felt altered by what had happened on them. He grew up and became a police detective, and at some point the case that had haunted his childhood became the case that defined his professional life. He began working at the way retired investigators sometimes work the cases that will not let them go, quietly, persistently, without the institutional resources of an active investigation, but with something that sometimes matters more than resources, which is the refusal to accept that the silence is permanent. What Hennigan found, and what Ray Johnson found working parallel threads, pointed consistently toward Charles Melquist. The list in the apartment, the geographic proximity of the Bonnie Lescott murder to the Grimes site, the phone calls, the timing, the profile of a man who killed young girls and felt entitled to the killing and wanted someone to know it even as he avoided being caught for it. The twist in this case is not a single revelation. It is an accumulation. It is the slow, terrible realization that the answer was always there, visible in the files, present in the evidence, named in the testimony of investigators who saw it clearly, and was buried not by accident but by design. By the machinery of a city that protected certain things and certain people, because protecting them was easier than the alternative. Charles Melquist killed Bonnie Lescott. He was convicted and died in prison. He had a list of girls from the Grimes neighborhood in his apartment. He had the geographic knowledge and the predatory pattern, and the specific, chilling habit of maintaining contact with his crimes after committing them that the phone calls to Loretta Grimes reveal. He matched the geography. He matched the timing. And he was questioned briefly, and then left alone in a way that has never been adequately explained. The mob connection. The suggestion that Melquist benefited from relationships that extended into the infrastructure of Chicago's political and criminal world has never been proven with the kind of hard documentary evidence that a court would require. But it has been documented circumstantially by researchers who have spent years following the threads, with enough specificity and enough consistency that dismissing it entirely requires ignoring a substantial body of evidence pointing in the same direction. Ray Johnson said it plainly. Somebody still does not want this case solved. He said it as a statement of fact, not as speculation, not as the dramatic conclusion of someone trying to make a story more interesting than it actually is. He said it because the evidence of active suppression, the firing of Glaus, the abandoned Melquist lead, the phone calls that produced no investigation, the way the case kept arriving at the edge of something and being turned away, is too consistent and too patterned to be explained by ordinary investigative failure alone. In 2022, WGN Television in Chicago aired a documentary special about the Grimes sisters case. It featured James Hennigan and new interviews with people connected to the investigation. It brought the case back into the public conversation in Chicago for the first time in years. The Cook County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit acknowledged the coverage and confirmed that the case remained officially open. New forensic possibilities exist today that did not exist in 1957. DNA analysis can now extract biological information from materials and surfaces that would have yielded nothing to the science available at the time of the original investigation. If any physical evidence from the scene or from the autopsies was properly preserved, and some of it may have been, store of it the way that evidence from major cases is sometimes stored, waiting for technology to catch up with what it contains, it is possible that modern analysis could produce something the original investigation could not. It is possible. Not certain, not guaranteed, but possible, and possibility, in a case this old and this cold, is not nothing. It is in fact the only thing keeping the door open, the only thing standing between the silence that the original investigation produced and the answer that Barbara and Patricia Grimes deserve. Their names are still in the file. Their case is still listed as open, somewhere in Cook County in a filing cabinet or a digital archive or both. There is a folder that has not been stamped closed. And as long as that folder exists, as long as the case remains open, as long as there are people like James Hennigan and Ray Johnson who refuse to let the silence become permanent, the possibility remains. The possibility that someone, someday, will pull the right thread, will find the right document, will locate the right witness who has been carrying a piece of this story inside them for 67 years and who is finally ready to let it go. The possibility that Barbara and Patricia Grimes will get what they have been waiting for since December 28, 1956, justice. Barbara Grimes was 15 years old. She had a wide, genuine smile and dark hair and plans for a future she never got to live. She was the serious one, the steady one, the one whose presence made a room warmer and whose absence made it permanently colder. Patricia Grimes was 12 years old. She was electric and loud and completely devoted to the things she loved. She was PT. The one who filled every space she entered with something irreplaceable. The one who had seen Love Me Tender 10 times, and would have gone back for an 11th without a moment's hesitation. They left home on a Friday evening in December to do something they loved. They never came back. And the city that failed to find them, while there was still a chance, has never stopped carrying that failure. The way a body carries an old wound that healed on the surface, but never fully closed underneath. This case shattered something in Chicago. Not just in McKinley Park. Not just in the working-class Catholic neighborhoods of the Southwest Side, but in the whole city. It shattered the particular innocence of a community that believed its streets were safe, that believed the ordinary rituals of ordinary life, a Friday night, a movie theater, a bus ride home, were protected by some implicit contract between a neighborhood and the world. That contract was broken on December 28, 1956, and it was never fully repaired. How could someone do this? How could a person look at two sisters' children, beloved and innocent and completely undeserving of harm, and choose to do what was done to them. How could they then make phone calls to their grieving mother, not out of remorse but out of pride? How could an entire institutional machinery designed to find answers and deliver justice look directly at the evidence and turn away from it? The world still struggles to understand this level of cruelty. Not just the cruelty of the crime itself, but the cruelty of the silence that followed it. The cruelty of a system that valued its own comfort and its own connections more than it valued the lives of two girls from South Damon Avenue. Evil does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive wearing something recognizable. Sometimes it arrives in an ordinary car on a cold street, offering a ride home. Sometimes it wears the face of an institution that is supposed to protect you. Sometimes it is the silence at the end of a phone call that should have been traced and was not, the lead that should have been followed and was not, the truth that should have been spoken and was buried instead. Barbara and Patricia Grimes deserved better. They deserved it in life and they deserved it in death. And they deserve it still. Tonight, in whatever quiet room you are listening from, say their names. Remember them. Not as victims only, but as who they actually were. Two sisters who loved Elvis and each other, and a Friday night at the movies and the whole long road of their lives that was taken from them before they ever got to walk it. Thank you for listening tonight. If this case stayed with you, and I believe it will, please leave a comment below. Share this with someone. Subscribe if you have not already. Good night, and stay safe.